welcome to this Meet the Mentor session, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Salil Shetty, who's the Secretary General of Amnesty International, an organisation that's been fighting for human rights for over 50 years now. And this conference has been all about young people, and I don't think anyone could have been failed to be moved by the young people who spoke during the opening ceremony, and especially the young, very brave young woman called Shabana, who came from Afghanistan, and her story was absolutely amazing. And there's been a lot here about the education of women and how important that is, and how we can affect so much change if we do educate our young women. And we've got 28.5 million children in conflict-affected areas of the world at the moment who are out of school, and over half of them are young girls. So if education is a fundamental human right, how do we enforce it, Salil?
Well, I just want to make sure, are people able to hear us at the back? Can you hear us? Okay, thank you. How do you enforce human rights, particularly education? Well, I think the interesting thing is that while some of the other rights are much more contested and political in their nature, education is, it's very hard to find somebody who would disagree that education is a good thing. So in a sense, you're in a politically uncontested space, I think, when it comes to education. But having said that, historically, knowledge and education is also a tool of privilege and exploitation. So, you have a narrow elite very often who have access to education, and it's not in their interest to allow everybody else to have the same access to knowledge. So education is, on the one hand, potentially an axis of inequality, and you know that the world is seeing growing inequality. On the other hand, it's a huge opportunity to address fundamental forms of discrimination and inequality. So how do you enforce it? Like any human right, education has been mentioned twice in the International Covenant for Economic Social Rights, in 2 articles, given its importance. And every state which is a signatory, and most countries in the world are signatory, have an obligation to make sure that every child, and indeed every adult, has lifelong learning, access to quality education. Enforcement, domestically you should be able to enforce it legally, but internationally there are more opportunities now. There are committees at the UN, etc. But ultimately my view is that these are also things which require societal change. If societies and parents and communities don't push for this, things are not going to change. But interestingly, in developing countries and poor countries, what we're finding is there's a huge appetite and demand for education. Parents all over the world want their children to get good quality education. The challenge is that delivery systems are not able to meet them. So I'm not so sure it's an enforcement problem. It's a system and delivery problem and an accountability problem.
Okay, thank you. So we've got some lovely young people here, so I hope they're going to ask questions later on. It's really good to see you. Why do you think the engagement of young people is so important? And what's their role in effecting change in the future?
First, I guess, just simply the demographics. The world has never had a demographic sort of youth bulge like we are seeing today. 1.5 billion people in the sort of young people's age group. So in a sense, you simply can't ignore that reality. It's a massive number. And but beyond just the fact that there's so many of them, I think my experience is that you find some of the most creative, innovative ideas coming from young people. They have less baggage, less prejudice. They're not carrying the cobwebs which older people carry. It's easy for me to say it. I'm now in the.
At me while you say that.
No, at me actually. I should hold a mirror. No, I think it's just a fact that they're not boxed into the old ideas, so you just find a lot of new ideas. but having, I mean, the other side of it also is that with all the new ideas and the new sort of innovations which come up, what we are seeing across the world today is that young people are also getting increasingly impatient. There's a great deal of anger and frustration. There is a real collapse in the trust that people generally and young people have in traditional leadership, whether it's leadership in government or leadership in the business sector. So, I mean, if we don't engage them, I think the world's going to be in great difficulty. What we are seeing today, for example, in Ukraine, but you know, it's not just Ukraine or Syria, it's every Venezuela, for example, right now. People, you know, kids are on the street in a big way, and it's a combination. So on the one hand, it's growing inequality, it's poverty, unemployment, but it's also the lack of voice. A lot of young people feel that they don't have a voice. The famous case of the Tunisian vegetable vendor, Mohamed Bouzizi, who set himself on fire in the streets of one of the smaller towns in Tunisia. You know, on the one hand, he was not able to even sell his vegetables. On the other hand, there was no place for him to express himself. So, I mean, that was a trigger for so much of the Arab Spring, but it's really all over the world.
Yeah, actually, mentioning the Arab Spring, one thing that played a huge part in the Arab Spring was Twitter and social media. So how do you see the role of social media in promoting human rights from Amnesty's point of view? What do you think it will do?
It's central, and I'll come to that in a moment. I just wanted to say, you know, there's a very famous quotation from an old man in Czechoslovakia, then Czechoslovakia, where young people played a key role in the Velvet Revolution. And I remember, you know, what he said was that now we are all students. Because you asked, what are young people doing? Because traditionally the idea is that some older persons have to lead younger people because they are the leaders of the future. It's turned upside down, because actually in many places they're leading and older people are following. And the challenge we have is that there's a lot of enragement. I don't know if there's a word like is that an English word?
Enragement. I don't know, but we'll make it one now.
I just made one up. Okay.
That's how language evolves.
So when you feel enraged, I'm calling it enragement, but just in order to make it rhyme with engagement, because I think there's a lot of rage, there's a lot of enragement or outrage you find, but if you can move that from enragement to engagement, then you know the whole channeling of the anger and the energy into something positive. And so coming to the digital and the social media question, I mean, there's no doubt that it's playing a transformatory role. There's no question about it. But before we go into the digital social media question, let me also say that one of the transformational things that's happened is even traditional media, because often when we think about the Arab Spring and all of these places, we think of Twitter, we think of Facebook, but the whole idea of real-time investigative journalism and exposés from the ground, even from mainstream media, has completely transformed. But social media is, I mean, particularly so because it's allowed for more citizen reporting. People can report from the ground, even if they're not a journalist. And essentially, we're now in a situation where there is no place to hide. So if you think of what's happened in Syria, for example, what Bashar al-Assad is doing today is not that different from what his father did, you know, his grandfather, you know, the family did in the past. But they could get away with it. Today, you know, in a few minutes from when something happens, you'll find YouTube uploading of mobile phone recorded videos. If you take what happened in Sri Lanka, I mean, the cameras, the killing fields in Sri Lanka where the Tamils were killed, 40,000 of them were killed, were not done in front of a, you know, media camera. But there was no place to hide. All the evidence is there now through mobile phone recordings of what really happened. So I think it is transformational. It also has provided a great deal of anonymity for the protesters. So Twitter, for example, in this part of the world is massive.
Yeah. How many people here use social media on a regular basis? Put your hands up. Okay. So all the young people, that's very good to see. Because otherwise that's all ruined if you didn't use it. Anybody tweeting at the moment? No? You just tweeted. Jolly good. That's good to hear. You alluded to what's happening at the moment in Ukraine. And there's been quite a lot of pressure, and especially for the media, they've come up against a lot of pressure. The free speech is being suppressed there. What are you doing as Amnesty International in that region to support people?
Well, Amnesty's work comes in often after, conflicts, because during the conflict you don't even have access to those places. So what we do during conflict right now, whether it's South Sudan, Ukraine, or the Central African Republic, we try and record the violations. So there is witness and there is documented evidence. So at a later point, the perpetrators of human rights violations can be held to account. The second thing we do is to put pressure on governments to make sure that they put in place human rights monitoring at points like this. In fact, I'm traveling tonight to Germany to meet the Chancellor, Merkel, who has great influence, we believe, on the Russian authorities, but also on the Ukrainian authorities. I mean, one of the challenges we have in Ukraine now, if you look at it, is Crimea has effectively long been run from Russia anyway. So yes, there's a whole issue about why they're getting away with this referendum, etc. But we are actually more concerned now about what happens to the rest of Ukraine. It's not a country which has ever had a proper criminal justice system. They don't have an independent police complaints mechanism. So we believe that the West actually has a very important role to use this opportunity to put in place basic human rights mechanisms across Ukraine. Otherwise, you're going to have a situation where the rest of Ukraine will also face a lot of pressure.
Right, okay. Now, you're very much a neutral organisation. You don't get politically involved. How do you maintain that neutrality in such a political situation?
I mean, two ways. Number one, I think, is the quality of the research and evidence gathering. So we don't rely on secondary research. We have over 500 primary researchers. So we have an office in Moscow. We have a team in Ukraine. And so we gather the evidence directly based on facts. And since we don't have any political or religious or secular affiliation, that's not an issue. We also don't take any money from governments or companies. So our money comes entirely from individual members. We have more than 3 million members, ordinary people contributing. So that's on the one hand. The second hand, a second issue is by being consistent in how we deal with issues. So whether it's the use of torture by the United States government in Guantanamo or something which the Russians do, we call it. We call it for what it is. And so I think everybody knows that we don't have, we have no favors. I mean, the good thing is everybody is critical of Amnesty. So when I remember when I joined Amnesty in one of my first interviews on Al Jazeera, so the interviewer said to me,
"Why are you?" I saw that this morning. I watched it. Yes.
So, but this is an early one, and I remember, the interviewer asking me, "Why are you so pro-Israel?"
That's
so
right.
I said, "Oh, that's nice." I mean, normally I'm told that we're anti-Israel, So, but it's good as long as people criticize us from all sides, we're okay. So.
Isn't that quite difficult, though? If everybody is always criticising you.
I mean, speaking truth to power is never easy, but somebody's got to do it. So.
Absolutely. Well, it's good that you're doing it for us. Can I just ask you a question about Amnesty itself? So the world is changing all around us. So how is Amnesty as an organisation changing to adapt to that world? I know there's been more criticism there, and
sure.
You've had quite a difficult ride.
No, I think, all organizations have to, Amnesty is a people's movement. It's not even just an organization because we're a democratically run movement by the 3 million members. So it's a very complex sort of body to run. But if I can, and just take you back, let's come to Amnesty in a minute. I don't want to avoid the question, but I want to say a little bit more about digital media because we talked about all the positive benefits of digital media and how it's allowing people to express. It's almost like a freedom of expression issue. But there's also a downside which we shouldn't forget because every time you have a footprint on the digital media, repressive governments know how to find you. So you have the other side to it. So, and there are enough governments who are tracking very closely as to who are the protesters, who are the people who are the opposition. So there's a whole downside to the digital media footprint, which we need to be very conscious of. And of course, we have now, the truth coming out about what the United States has been doing using PRISM and the NSA. And this debate has been going on particularly since 9/11 on, how do you balance national security issues with the issue of public interest? How do you get that balance right? And our view is that when it comes to questions of public interest, the presumption has to be, in relation to governments, has to be maximum transparency. In relation to individual freedoms, the presumption must be maximum privacy. So, there's two sides to this argument. It's important to understand it. For Amnesty, we've got drawn into a new debate post Assange, WikiLeaks, Snowden, etc. And Snowden was very interesting because when he was holed up in the airport in Moscow, for a few days, President Putin suddenly became a big friend of Amnesty because Snowden invited us into the meeting at the airport. So for a few days, he liked us.
Is that a sort of friend that you want?
Yeah, no, but I mean, what I wanted to say is that, there's a huge amount of, invasion of privacy, and there are many corporations which are also complicit. You know that now we have discovered that many of the big IT providers, etc., are now opening back doors and giving information to governments. And they, of course, some of them claim that we don't have a choice because this is a legal requirement. But we do believe that many of them who had a choice have not exercised their choice either. So there's lots of new challenges around. Of course, you could say that historically governments always like to pry on individuals they don't like because, I remember when I was growing up in Bangalore, I woke up one day and discovered that my telephone number was on the front page of the newspaper. My father's a journalist. So our phone was being tapped. And, it's always true historically that governments open letters, their phone tap. So you could say what's different? They're just tapping into your internet now. But right now they're able to literally go into your bedrooms.
Which, that's not a good thing.
Not a good thing.
Not a good
Well,
thing
depending
at
on-
all. You certainly don't want to come into my bedroom.
So Amnesty, you want me to go back to
I want you to go back to Amnesty. This is obviously something you don't want to talk about, no?
I'd love to talk about Amnesty. It's
Is it
my
right?
favorite topic, actually.
Because that you have had quite
Yeah,
a lot
no.
of
So
criticism about what you've done, what you tried to do.
The big debate inside Amnesty is, that given the way the world has changed in the last 50 years, how do you move from being an organization which has a very strong base and influence in Europe and North America to being an organization which is truly global? So, historically, the way in which you could change the human rights reality, say in Africa or Asia or Latin America, you could do this by influencing Western governments to put pressure on the governments in the developing countries to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Now, as you can imagine, like if you take a country like Brazil or my country, India for that matter, I think there are serious limitations to this model because these countries now are very powerful in their own right. And if anything, if you have the US government or the British government calling the Brazilian or the Indian government, you might actually have the reverse effect. So what I'm focused on doing is to try and build Amnesty as a membership movement in the developing world. So we don't need, of course, it's very powerful for Amnesty to have members in Europe and North America. The international solidarity is very important. But it's equally important that people in the Middle East, the people in the US, because most of the violations are happening in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. Why is it that the people from those countries are not standing up for their own rights? There's still some places like North Korea where that's impossible for it to happen. But more and more countries are opening up and people can become members. And that requires a lot of internal changes in Amnesty, including moving our staff on the ground from the center to on the ground. So that's never easy. And Amnesty is a democratic movement, so we debate about everything endlessly. So.
And how long has that debate lasted then?
Well, it's not going to change. It's going to go on, and there's big debates. There's all debates all the time. There's new debates as well. But it's been a hot debate. But we've now, I think, come to a conclusion that that's the right thing to do.
Right. And so you say you've got 3 million members and you're trying to get more members in the developing world. How does your membership split then, So how many have you got from the West? Is it still the majority are in the West?
Yeah, predominant. I mean, it's a dominant majority because historically, the concept of human rights has been much more built into Western countries and thinking. I mean, in Western countries, in almost every school and university, you'd have an amnesty group because there's a long history of working on human rights issues. But we have a long way to go in the developing world. So.
And is that going to, do you see that as quite a tough challenge? And how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it practically?
So, I mean, the way we are doing it is, we are actually, the most important thing is we've never reached out to people in those countries, and we are starting to do that. And there's two sets of things we do. On the one hand, it's dealing with violations as they happen. But the other area, which is very relevant for the younger people here, is how do you bring this into schools and universities? How do you create rights-respecting societies? Because if you don't have, people who respect human dignity and values and who are not prejudiced and judgmental in the way they behave and operate on a daily basis, you can't change. Governments and societies don't change just in a kind of top-down way. It also has to happen bottom-up.
Okay, thank you. I think it'd be quite good now to open up for questions. Do you agree? I mean, it'd be really lovely to have some questions from the young people here. Has anybody got a question? Yes? No? You do. Excellent.
So who's first?
Oh, you've got a microphone. Thank you.
Shall I just? Okay, thank you very much for that. I found it really interesting, and I think we need more voices from organizations like yours in conferences like this. So my question is, just following on from what you were saying now, since human rights are based and often observed as Western rhetoric, how would you, and since actually human rights education, I think is one of the most important things that we do need in schools, especially as, as we become more globalized and multicultural, how would you suggest, what would be your suggestion for us to implement this in societies where human rights language isn't really, it sounds threatening in a way to those governments? So what would be your suggestion for us to advance human rights in societies like that?
Thank you. And you didn't introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name's Dina Pasik. I work for the World Innovation Summit for Education in Qatar.
Ah, okay. Very good.
And I'm a student of human rights, so I really Amnesty International is first. If you go back to the roots of where human rights come from, there's no religion or no sort of value framework which is not in sync with human rights. I mean, the ideas of dignity and respect and equality, all of those basic underlying values cut across. And you can see why developing countries or countries in the Middle East would be quite skeptical, because very often the way in which Western governments have behaved have not been very consistent. So there's lots of double standards. But I mean, you take Bahrain, for example, in this part of the world. Western governments are very critical of what's happening in Syria, but they're much less critical of what's happening in Bahrain because they have the US base there, and they think that Iran is causing the trouble. So they have very different standards. So you can see why there's a cynicism and a degree of skepticism. But I mean, if you take Qatar, for example, so I've been in Qatar recently. We're working on this whole issue of labor conditions in Qatar in the run-up to the World Cup. And having spent some time in the labor camps myself, some of the conditions are shocking. And this is one of the richest countries in the world, and there's no reason why laborers from South Asia who have come there because they're fleeing from poverty should be living under those circumstances. The wage payments are delayed, literally, leaking roofs. They've reached a point, some of them have not been paid for 6 to 8 months. They don't even know where their next meal is going to come from. Now, the interesting thing is that when we met with the Prime Minister of Qatar, he was very open to the question of addressing this. So I was pleasantly surprised, I must say, because I thought normally governments, when you point out the truth, they first start by denying, and second, they talk about all the programs they have in place, which most often is never being implemented. But in fact, I guess partly because there's pressure because of the World Cup, they're open and they're starting to do it. Now, human rights education in schools, Amnesty has got a program called Human Rights Friendly Schools. So we've got a lot of content and methodology. Now, how you introduce it in a way that works in a particular context, I mean, you'd be better placed to figure that out in Qatar as to how do you do it. But I think if it's done in a sensitive way and in a kind of a staged way, it's very possible. I mean, if you take something like, I'd start with something more neutral, I'd say.
Thank you. That was a very good question.
Hello, I'm Filza from our own English high school. So human rights is for the humans. And to enhance the knowledge of human rights, we use education. But that small rural places in countries like India, etc., over there the people are not aware of the human rights, so they can't even raise their voice because they don't know what their human rights are. So how do you suggest that Amnesty International is such a big organization? It's important to focus on such small places and educating these people who are poor and their human rights. How do you suggest you do that?
So, in a classic sense, when you talk about human rights, we divide them into civil, political rights and economic, social rights. And economic, social rights are related to poverty and education and health, and civil, political rights are much more about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of association. Now, in practice, if you take a country like India or most developing countries, this distinction is not very meaningful because such a large proportion of the population is poor to start with. But often it's the poor who don't have a voice, and it's those who don't have a voice who are poor. So the two things are very interlinked. What can we do to reach out? We're trying to do what we can, but there's just limits in how much you can do it. So for me, the solution really is to make this a people's movement. So it's not dependent on an organization or individuals. It needs to become viral, and all of you, who are in schools and colleges really should help to make this message go far beyond what an organization can do. So I think we're trying to do our best, but there's much, much more to be done. But, going back to the question which was asked earlier, this concept that human rights is a Western construct is very problematic because, I always say this. So if you're in a favela in Brazil, if you're a woman living in a favela in Brazil who's facing domestic violence, who's having to deal with the narco traffickers, who doesn't have employment, the police are beating you up as well. And then you go and tell her, no, you don't have a human rights problem because this is a Western concept. It's kind of a ridiculous statement to make, So, for those who are actually suffering from human rights violations, which is a significant proportion of the population, this idea of is it Western or not is not an issue. It's a question of what's happening to their life.
Okay, thank you for that. You made a...
There's some more questions.
Oh, right. I'll just go to it. Okay.
Hi there. Hi, it's Mark Terrell. I've just written a book on scaling, so how to scale things. My question, though, isn't about scaling, it's about prisons in the United States. So if you look at the United States, it's one of the unspoken about topics, is the huge incarceration rate in the United States, worse than any other country in the world. I'd like to know your views on that, given that also the US would be large contributors as members to the Amnesty International organization, about how one could put more focus on that.
So, the US is, on many issues, the US is full of internal contradictions. So, and this is one of the issues which I referred to earlier. So, a country which is so kind of prescriptive about the importance of freedom of expression is busy curbing internet freedoms. On the issue of death penalty, for example, it's the only nation in the Western Hemisphere, in the developed sort of set of nations, which still uses a death penalty. There's no other country in Europe or in North America or Australia, any of the countries which are rich, which continue to use death penalty as a form of punishment, which from all evidence, there's, every research that's been done, death penalty offers no deterrent effect. In fact, countries who stopped using death penalty have actually reduced their crime rates. Fortunately, 14 or 15 US states now have stopped using death penalty, but the federal government is still not able to enforce it. So the incarceration question is not very different because if you look at incarceration in the US or anywhere else, you'd find that it's deeply discriminatory. There's massive incarceration rates in the US, and they're mostly African Americans and people of color. It's a justice system which has failed. And so it is an issue that Amnesty is concerned about. It's not a big focus issue because ACLU and others are working on this, so we support them. One of the things we have to do often is that we have to kind of divide the labor because we can't take up all the issues. So we are definitely focusing on the issue of the sort of war on terror-related human rights abuses of the United States, but less so on incarceration, but that doesn't make it any less important.
Okay, thank you for that. We got any other questions? Yes, this lady here.
Hi, my name is Suad. I'm from Bahrain, but I live here for some Amnesty International reasons. What happens if one of you guys get into prison?
I like the way you put that.
Yeah. We don't want to
Very
dwell into the.
diplomatic.
Yeah. What happens if one of you guys go to prison because of what you do? Like many journalists are in prison in Syria and in Bahrain or, Tunisia. Amnesty International are also going to prison. What do you do in that case? Like, isn't Nabil Rajab one of your members?
Yeah,
He's in prison till now, like it's over a year, right?
Of course, yeah. No,
So
I mean,
what do you
that's Amnesty's kind of core business. Amnesty started from the issue of political prisoners and releasing what we call prisoners of conscience. Prisoners of conscience in Amnesty terminology is anybody who is imprisoned for no reason except for their identity or for expressing their beliefs. So this is a core business. So, I mean, Amnesty's worked on releasing tens of thousands of prisoners over the last 50 years, some very iconic ones like Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar, but the majority of the people we work on are unsung heroes. I mean, Nabil at least is well known in Bahrain as an activist, but there are so many Bahrainis who are locked up. Nobody knows their names, but so we keep pushing on those issues, including my own colleagues. In the middle of the Egyptian revolution, the first revolution, two of my colleagues were missing for 48 hours. So we had to. I mean, it's not even being imprisoned; they were just disappeared. So this is something which we have to live with. Our offices have been bombed in Peru. I mean, this is a terrain which comes with a degree of risk. So we have systems in place to deal with it. It's never perfect. We don't have the resources. We're talking about digital issues. Amnesty's website is constantly attacked from all sides. And if you want a perfectly secure website, you'll have to spend tens of millions of dollars to get security, which is what the big corporations do. We don't have the resources, so we just allow everybody to visit us, whether it's the Chinese or the Americans.
Well, I suppose that's good that you're so open. Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions? Anywhere else? Anybody? Anybody around there? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Meghna from GEMS, our own English high school, Dubai. And as a student, education is never stressed upon human rights. We have been taught something or the other, probably when we were in grade 4, grade 5, unity is strength and all that. Honesty is the best policy and things. And so, I've never got the concept of human rights exactly into my mind. So do you think it's right to blame education as one of the reasons why human rights is not yet prevalent in society as it should be? We can see human rights lacking even in educated folks today. So do you think we could blame education, and can we expect Amnesty to bring about a change in education such that we could have human rights imbibed in each and every student, even if not physics or chemistry?
Well, I mean, that's a dream. That's the vision. That's the hope. So, and I think, really it's not just Amnesty. Amnesty is a catalyst, a vehicle. I think it's for us to make it happen. Amnesty is a membership-based movement. So everybody owns Amnesty. It's not owned by somebody else. So, but it's absolutely true that if you take, for example, the situation in Syria today, the millions of people who've been displaced, who've lost their lives, if you could imagine a Syria where every Syrian was imbibed with values of fairness and dignity and respect and equality, all the core principles of human rights, would we be facing this conflict today? Hopefully not, So when we dream of a world of the future, it's something we have to build in. The Convention on the Rights of the Child actually insists that all education systems do have human rights education built into it. But in practice, you have somebody giving a lecture. I always say in India, for example, and Kajal is here, who's the chair of our India board. We're hoping to really push this in the Indian schools as well. But it's very easy in India for you to, if you say, why don't you have a class on human rights? Within 2 days, the teacher would have forced all the kids to by heart the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so in the morning, you'll be by hearting the Universal Declaration. In the afternoon, the teacher will be beating up the children. So for us, it's, when we say human rights, it's about human rights friendly schools, which means it's about how do you make decisions, how do you respect children, how do you relate, the relationship between the teachers and the children, the school and the community. It's a whole school approach. So it's not easy, it's easier said than done, but I think where you have societies which are rights respecting, you have less violations. That's just the reality. I mean, the Nordic countries are always cited as a good example where they really kind of, imbibe this at the earliest stage.
When you say a human rights friendly school, what does that look like?
So, I mean, you can go online. We've got lots of materials on this, but fundamentally it's about what changes need to be done in the way the school is run, how the school engages internally within the school system, the governance, the relationship with the teachers and education inside the school, but also how they relate to the community outside. Because, it's really important for the school to operate in a because it's not a matter of just teaching it and then behaving the wrong way. So it's actually living the experience. That's fundamentally what it is.
And do you think schools should be giving students more of a voice as well? Is that all
Absolutely.
part
The
of
school
it?
governance is a key part of the methodology. So we've got governance, we have all the different elements in it. And some of the school, and it happens across the world, the human rights friendly schools programs running in different parts of the world. Some amazing experiences in Africa and Latin America as well.
Right, so schools should practice what they're preaching, really.
We all should.
Well, don't look at me when you say that.
But Anne, you're the moderator. I have to look at you.
Yeah,
Who
all
else
right.
can I look at?
Perhaps I'm just feeling guilty when you looked at me in that way. But I mean, I think I'm probably one of the greatest critics of people always wanting to put things on the curriculum, and everybody says this and that should be taught in schools. Now, if schools taught everything that people wanted to put on the curriculum, there'd be no time for any of the real subjects. But I will go back on myself here, because I do think human rights is a really, really important thing, but also teach it, know about it. And I think it's the stories, and I don't know about you, I'll go back to that opening ceremony, the stories from those young people that really, really brings it home to you. We can talk about it in a sort of very disconnected way, but when you hear from people, especially young people that you can relate to, that sort of tells you everything you want to know. I mean, how many of you were at the opening ceremony? Yeah? Yeah? You weren't there? Well, that's such a shame, because the stories were amazing. So I'm telling you about something you weren't involved in. But you'll see it on YouTube. They're amazing stories. Anyway, so moving on, another question. The gentleman over there. Sorry. It's because I'm moving around.
Tawfiq Rahim here in Dubai, work for GlobeSite. My question, as you push for advocacy and highlight critical issues on human rights throughout the world, you're reflecting kind of on the current state of things and pushing for a different state of things. And I would posit, and you probably agree, that while it's a challenge, it's the easier part of the challenge, because the more difficult part is the process to get to where we want to go. And when you look at this region and what has happened in the last 3 years, and you look at this entire optimism for democracy, change, human rights in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya, and what has happened since, now when we point out, oh, there isn't democracy, or there isn't a state of human rights that's acceptable in Egypt, for example, where you have journalists in prison, people go, fine, but at least it's not getting worse. And we don't want your democracy because we don't know where that will lead. And you look at a country in this region, in the GCC, like Saudi Arabia, which is absolutely abysmal in terms of its human rights on a global scale, which people here don't want to talk about because we live in Dubai and we're acquiesced to these type of things. But if you said, well, now become a democracy tomorrow, someone could say that process in and of itself could undermine the whole country even more. So how do you balance where we want to go with really facilitating a process that actually leads to that change and doesn't lead us in the wrong direction?
I was waiting for that question, Tariq. First of all, I think, it's really important not to equate democracy with human rights. As it is even more important not to equate democracy with elections. Coming from what is supposedly the world's largest working democracy, I can tell you that we have a long way to go on human rights issues. So I think first we need to kind of separate the two. Amnesty's position is it doesn't matter what your political system is or your economic system is, violation of human rights are unacceptable. Because, there are many governments which will say, no, we have a free economic model, so therefore, this will follow. Once you have a free market, somehow the civil political rights will get sorted out. And there are others who will say that, we are not a democracy, so we don't need to bother about human rights. Or there are others who say, we are a democracy, so it's implicit, it's implied. We respect human rights. No, you might be having elections, but that doesn't mean a fig, for ordinary people. Because a lot of the democracies you're talking about are shallow democracies. The institutions simply don't exist. Because the assumptions when you say democracy means, do you have an independent judiciary? Do you have a free press? Do you have an informed electorate? So just to say you're a democracy doesn't mean anything. Do you have the conditions to make a democracy a truly working democracy? So, what I've always said about the Arab Spring changes in Libya, in Egypt, in all of the countries where it's going wrong, is that, and I said this from the very beginning, that what we've done is we've got rid of the dictators, but not the dictatorships. Because the underlying reality has not changed. Now, does it mean that we should have retained Mubarak in power? I'm not so sure about that. So that's a different question now. So how much time does it take for change to happen? And, are the processes in place? Now, the problem with Egypt that we have is that not only that, we've got rid of things without, figuring out what needs to happen, but the direction of travel is completely wrong. I mean, locking up the Al Jazeera journalists, or indeed many other journalists, is not taking us towards democracy or human rights or any of these good things. So on the one hand, I think that we have to understand the elements that need to be put in place for human rights to flourish. And secondly, I think we need to have some patience because, most of these countries who enjoy full freedoms now, it didn't happen in 2 or 3 years. I mean, it just takes longer. I'm not saying that we should just keep quiet while they're continuing to abuse human rights. We'll keep raising it, but we have to calibrate our expectations.
Okay, thank you. This young lady here has a question.
Good afternoon. My name is Bushra. I'm from the GEMS Aron Indian School. My question is that even if the idea of education as a basic human right is implemented in all over the world or in all countries, how do you ensure that the quality of education is, good and whatever is being taught is right? Because in countries like India, where we have shortage of something as basic as power, how do you ensure that students are, they have access to good education? Yeah.
So I must say that it's not like I know the answers to all your questions. Huh? I should.
Why not?
And the questions are getting tougher and tougher, I see, as you get to the dessert or something like that. So. No, but I mean, I think in a sense you answered the question because it's not a question of just saying we have education. It's a question of what kind of education. Because if you don't have the education of the right quality and if the basic pieces are not in place, just to say it's a human right. I mean, as you know, in the case of India, it's not just in the directive principles of the Constitution. Now, education's been made a fundamental right, and we have a right to education which has been passed just a few years ago, which means that the government is obligated not just to provide education, but every private school is also meant to make it accessible to all communities and all people, which is a big, big challenge. So it's not just a question of not having, infrastructure, but it's also having the right attitude, So if you say that if you're from a particular caste, you can't come to the school. If you're a Muslim, you can't come to the school. If you're a girl, you're being discriminated against. So a lot of work needs to be done on dealing with those those underlying challenges. And yeah, physically, infrastructure is a big problem. So, and particularly if you talk about digital access, because now increasingly right to digital access is almost a right in itself, because it opens up the possibilities of knowledge in a way that is unbelievable. We were talking this morning to somebody who's now providing education from Harvard and MIT online. You actually can get it online. So it's really potentially a big equalizing force.
Okay, there's also the question of whose education are you providing as well. So you just think about education in the whole, but what should be taught and what shouldn't be taught is a huge issue. We've got creation. Should we have creationism being taught? Evolution? Should people have sex education? Shouldn't they? Once you start getting into that, it becomes very tricky indeed. You can say everybody have education, but it's certainly down to what education, which particular party will want you to have. And that's a very, very difficult thing. And is that something that you get involved in?
I mean, Amnesty is not, in a sense, focused on educational content. That's not the focus of Amnesty's work. But, I mean, there's no question that when women become literate and more exposed and empowered, it fundamentally alters the human rights situation in any given context. There's no question about it. I mean, there's enough evidence to show that. So we don't have a sort of a deep engagement with content and curriculum. But some of these things are really obvious.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions anywhere? Yes? Lady here. I'll sit down and get out of the way. You can ask.
Good afternoon. I'm Patricia Vickers. I work for GEM. But I wanted to know what Amnesty International does for women in Saudi Arabia who are completely invisible and not treated very nicely and denied the right of education, etc.
So Saudi Arabia is one of the classic cases of double standards of the West. So because they have so much oil, Western powers don't ask much questions of Saudi Arabia. That, of course, is now shaking a little bit because the Saudi footprint in different parts of the world is much more under question. So I think it's a sort of a shaking edifice. Amnesty's website is blocked in Saudi Arabia, and we don't have access. They don't allow us into the country. And every time we've raised an issue about the so-called Shura Council, which they have, and the sort of pretend democracy which they're putting in place, they get very annoyed with us. But I think my view is that Saudi Arabia is one of those countries which is going to sort of effectively collapse from internal contradictions. And there is a lot of tension right now. I mean, we are getting a lot of reports that the situation inside the country is very, very shaky. You saw what happened with the workers there recently. We had 2 people actually killed on the streets of Saudi Arabia, which has never happened before. And these were African workers. And what we said earlier, I mean, much as the government is trying to repress information flows, with all the digital explosion, it's very hard to keep things quiet. So I think change will come both when the Western sponsors start coming to, I mean, a lot of these, Mubarak was protected by the Americans for decades. We know that. So, and as soon as things started getting shaky, they will suddenly start, shifting allegiances. And that's what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia. As soon as it starts getting a bit shaky. I mean, why is it that the Russians, for example, are not facing sanctions from Europe right now? Because so much money from Russia is in Europe. In fact, today's newspapers are saying that, the markets are still reasonably okay because they're worried that if Russia is going to have sanctions, the Russians who put their money in Europe are going to pull it out. It's going to get the Western financial system, really shaky if that happens. So, all of these contradictions exist, So we want human rights, but not if it's going to put our money at risk. Same with the Chinese. I mean, Western leaders now, before they used to talk about Chinese human rights abuses, today they say, oh, really, it's very difficult, they don't listen to us. They never listen to you anyway, but you used to talk about it before. So now there's cash and trade involved, there's fudging that goes on.
Okay, thank you for that. Anybody else with a question? Anywhere? No? Everybody happy? Yeah?
And I just want to say one thing. if
Please
you were going
do.
to turn my microphone off before that.
No, because I've got a final question I have to ask that I think is asked of every mentor. So
So go
but
for
you
it.
You wanted to say something, though. Yeah.
No, I just want to say one thing in relation to the digital and social media and all of that. And I know, and it's very important because in Egypt, for example, there was all this thing about we are all Khalid Said, the Facebook page, which created all this dynamism. You know, those of you who follow Egypt, Wael Ghonim was here, based in Dubai as a Google executive who stood up in the heat of at a very difficult time. But all of the bloggers and sort of cyber activists in Egypt, they are the first people to say that the changes which have happened, positive or negative in Egypt, have of course been fueled and facilitated by social media. But there is no substitute for human conviction and courage. On Tahrir Square, the people who put their bodies in front of those tanks were not tweets or Facebook posts, they were human beings. And in human history, there's never been a substitute for human courage, conviction, belief, and passion, and that's never going to change. You can have the best technology in the world, you still need the human spirit.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So the final question that I have to ask you is, what do you think is the most promising development in education where we can expect to see real change delivered in the next 10 years?
Well, I think, and I have to answer the question.
You have to answer the question, definitely.
No, you said you have to ask it. You didn't say I have to answer it.
Sorry. No, you have to answer as well. If I have to ask, you have to answer.
I was saying to some other colleagues the other day as well. I've just come back from Nepal, and Nepal has there's so many issues in South Asia about discrimination against women, and Nepal is no exception to that. But 500,000 women in Nepal face a medical condition called uterine prolapse, which means literally a fallen womb, and it happens because of having too many children too young, and then having to carrying loads up mountains. So, we're talking about some of these women have been living with uterine prolapse, which is not a disease. It's literally a man-made condition. They've been living with that for 30 to 40 years. And I was in this remote village with these women. We were launching a global campaign called My Body, My Rights. And everything was looking kind of, hopeless and depressing. And then I found 3 doctors from Kathmandu, which is 5 hours away from the capital, who are coming there on a purely voluntary basis. They're medical students, they must be about sort of 18, 20-year-old, second year, third year medical students. And they have come there to run a health camp for these women, completely on a voluntary basis. It's not like they were going to that's not needed for their degree or anything of that sort. So, when I met them, I was saying that actually there's a lot of room for hope, because if there are so many young people who want to see change and who are doing something about it, then in 10 years' time, we're going to see a different world, So a great deal of optimism and hope, as much as all of the, the negative, gloomy stuff.